Everyone, the webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. We invite you to connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's conversation, and we'll be sure to retweet. The webinar will begin shortly and will be shared with you afterwards. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. We also encourage you to post questions in the Q&A box. We'll dedicate the last portion of the conversation to respond to those questions. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any resources that you see shared as links in the chat, will be compiled and shared in a follow-up email to all webinar registrants. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. Finally, before we get started, I would like to call your attention to our upcoming webinars. Next week on October 4th, we have an exciting doubleheader, starting with a Funder to Funder workshop on discovering pathways to astonishing success in connectivity, co-sponsored by the Patterson Foundation. Later that afternoon, we'll have a session co-sponsored by Foundations Inc. at 3 p.m. And the following week, we'll have an exciting doubleheader, starting with the Crucible of Practice Salon and Dolly Parton's Imagination Library, and followed by Engaging Every Student. Registration links for all of these sessions are being posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is Becky Miles-Polka, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us today for our Learning Tuesdays webinar, Learning from the Bright Spots, Examining Student Achievement Data During COVID-19. But before we begin our session, I have a question for you. The campaign has identified 4 areas for smart investment, and we have been asking our participants to weigh in on these areas. One of the silver linings from the pandemic is the sense of urgency and concrete progress on assuring digital equity. We would like to hear your opinion on this. We've hosted a series of webinars on digital equity, and it's important for us to hear from you what you think about this issue. So Sierra, if you could go ahead and launch that poll now, would appreciate it.
Having a slight difficulty, but should be up in about 2 seconds for everyone.
All right. We're looking really forward to today. We have such a stellar panel assembled for you, and the data that we're going to hear is really quite extraordinary, and we'll dig into that in just a little bit. We'll get the poll up. And Sierra, if we're still having trouble, maybe we'll just hold it and do it at the end, and I'll go ahead and introduce our moderator. What do you think?
Sounds great. I'll go ahead and get that sorted for everyone.
Okay, thank you. So it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Hedy Chang. And Hedy is the Executive Director and President of AttendanceWorks, a campaign for grade level reading implementation partner, one of our longest implementation partners. AttendanceWorks is a national and state level initiative aimed at advancing student attendance and closing equity gaps by addressing chronic absence. Hedy has been our moderator for many of our webinars on data, and you will hear in a moment why. Hint, she loves data. Hedy, welcome, and thank you for serving as our moderator today.
Thank you so much, Becky. It is truly my honor and pleasure to moderate today's panel and get to welcome this amazing set of key partners in this work. The campaign has been really working with partners in the field like Curriculum Associates, NWEA, since the pandemic started in 2020 to understand the impact of the pandemic on children's learning and development, and in particularly its impact on the long-standing opportunity and achievement gaps affecting children of color and children in economically economically challenged families. And as these partners have released reports, we've invited them to join us and share what they're seeing with those in the JLR network so that we can make sure that state and local leaders in philanthropy and national partners who are working to accelerate equitable learning recovery are driven by data, are driven not only by what we know is happening with learning loss, but the data that starts to help illuminate and give us clues about bright spots or promising and effective responses that we should be advancing throughout the field. You know, I look at the release of the NAEP data several weeks ago, and it was certainly disturbing. We saw significant declines in reading and math. And again, those troubling widening gaps in between the highest and the lowest achievers. And that data certainly brought home the dire impact of this pandemic. And we are also at Attendance Works seeing that these declines are occurring at the same time as we're seeing enormous increases in chronic absence. 10.1 million in the 2021 year, and that's an underestimate. And we think it has doubled from 8 to 16 million kids since before the pandemic. At the same time, what we can do is use this data to kind of understand not just the scope and scale of the challenge, but what are potential solutions. And even this NAEP data, which we're not going to talk about, I'll say a little bit and then we'll go on to other data sources today, you know, showed us and offered us some clues. We knew that kids who scored better were more likely to have their own computer, access to internet, have daily interactions with teachers and homework help. So that means what we want, that actually brings me to the point of this session, which is to gather the information our partners are collecting and analyzing so we can both understand scale, scope, who's most affected, but also what can make a difference, especially for those students and families who have already been struggling, even pre-pandemic, to gain an equal opportunity to learn, and who's unfortunately are experiencing even greater challenges as we work on recovery. But the recovery for all our students is essential to the well-being of our country. So with that, I am just delighted to be joined by this panel, extremely thoughtful panelists who each has their own unique contribution. So first we'll have, well, this is not in order. We're going to be taking turns throughout about how we, who gets to begin each conversation. But let me start first by introducing Dr. Miah Daughtery, who's the Vice President of Academic Services for Literacy at NWEA. By the way, after each, we're also going to be seeing in the chat links to people's longer bios. So I'll keep these short, but if you want to have more detail on anyone, just click on that bio. We'll also be joined by her partner, Dan Goldhaber, who is the director of CALDER at AIR and CEDAR at the University of Washington. They're sort of a duo who've been working together to move the work at NWEA. And then Julia Febiger, who's the director of research content at Curriculum Associates, and Libby Pier, who is the chief staff and director of impact at Education Analytics. Thank you so much for joining us. So our first question is that big one. What's the current data telling us? And Julia, would you do us the honor of starting this conversation off?
Yes, thank you, Hedy. Very glad to be here too. So we at Curriculum Associates have recently released 2 reports that I'm going to talk about here under the umbrella of the state of student learning in 2022. We are looking at a national data set of nearly 2 million students in reading and 2 million students in math for the first set of results that I'm going to go through, and then we'll get into the methodology of the next one. So you can go on to the next slide, would be fine. So there's a lot in this report that you can dig into on stateofstudentlearning.com. I'm going to start off by sharing a couple of the high-level findings here with you. By the way, it is very hard to summarize this at a high level because we looked at the data not only in reading and math, we also looked at it at each grade level, in some cases K, all the way up through 8. We also looked at domain data, and we disaggregated by student demographic group. So I encourage you to read the report for more detail, but at a high level, we saw that students are close to pre-pandemic levels, comparing the current school year to a pre-pandemic average, as well as looking at the prior spring. So we saw that reading has started to recover in the upper middle school grades, but we see areas of concern in the early elementary reading, particularly in the foundational domain of phonics. You can click ahead. In math, we see that students are still not recovered to pre-pandemic levels. This is a bit more widespread than the reading data, and it's a bit deeper of a deficit still, if you will. You keep clicking. We also see that for students who are in schools serving mostly Black and Latino students, there's recovery, which is great, to the pre-pandemic level. However, the historical inequities that predated the pandemic persist, and in some grade levels and subjects are exacerbated. And we're looking at data at the on-grade level students as well as below grade level students. And the below grade level data revealed a different story. In some ways, the on-grade level data is our best case scenario, and we're going to take a look at that now. So you can go ahead and click to the next slide. So first, I just want to orient you to how we're looking at the data, because there's a lot on the slides that I'm going to show. So the navy blue bar is the historical data. This is a combined average across the 17-18 and 18-19 school year. The gray here, it might turn teal later, is spring 21, and then the emerald or teal is the spring 2022 data. So you can click the mouse to bring up the next piece. Great, thank you. So in these orange boxes are the differences between spring 22 and the pre-pandemic average. So you can see that across all grades, the spring 22 data is below that of the pre-pandemic data, and the percentage point difference ranges from 2 to 9. So we see the biggest percentage point differences of students who are on grade level in the earlier grades. If you keep clicking, I think there's a, yep, and one more time. There we go, and one more time. There's a lot of clicking. One last time. Sorry about that. Thank you so much. So this is a lot of information to take in, but we wanted to pull it up so you could look at it. And this is just pointing to the areas of concern we see in grades 1 and 2, where those percentage point differences off the historical average are biggest. And then in the upper elementary into middle school grades, we see that students have gotten a lot closer to the pre-pandemic average. But however, as you've seen in NAEP and other national data sets, this still means that there's less than half of students who are on grade level. So getting to pre-pandemic is sufficient, right? Sorry, is necessary, but not sufficient. You can keep going. Thanks so much. Okay, so another data point that I want to draw your attention to that I alluded to in the key findings is the data that we looked at, the demographic data disaggregated at the school level. So we had access to the school level NCES data, if you are familiar with that. And I just want to be clear that we're looking at student level data, but in schools serving mostly Black students, in schools serving mostly Latino students, and in schools serving mostly white students. I'm also wanting to point out that this is just grade 4. In some ways, grade 4 had some of the strongest recovery. In other grades, it looks a little different. It might be a bit more nuanced. There might be some exacerbation. All of that said, you can see here that in spring 2022, across each of these 3 groups, there's a return to the pre-pandemic average of students who are on grade level. However, as the dotted lines are indicating, that does not bring everybody to parity. Ideally, we'd see every single bar here at 100%. We want all students to be reading on grade level, but we don't yet see that. So at minimum, we want all students to be, regardless of the demographic group they're in, at the same level. We're not seeing that yet, but we are seeing improvements within the schools serving mostly Black and within the schools serving mostly Latino students that we want to point out as a bright spot. you can go ahead and go on to the next slide. I mentioned briefly that the below grade level data, we see slightly different patterns. This is where our data reveals patterns that are more similar to what we saw in the latest NEAT results, where there's a widening gap between the students who are higher performing and lower performing. So students who were on grade level prior to the pandemic generally stayed on grade level in reading. And students who are below grade level, we see that there's a bit sometimes of an increase here. So regardless of the demographic group, you can see that the teal, I think emerald teal, we'll call it, those bars are longer in each of these three groups than prior to the pandemic. So for example, in the schools serving mostly Latino students, we now have 21% of students who are 2 or more grade levels below. That's what our below grade level data represents, compared to 17% pre-pandemic. And that means that there's more students in teachers' classrooms who are in need of intensive intervention, most likely. And so that makes a really big difference if you're at the classroom level, or if you're at the school or district level, as so many of you are. You can keep going. I know I've got a lot of data to share, so I'm trying to do my best to go quickly. So at the income level, we looked at data for schools based on the zip code they're in and the median household income of that zip code. So these are schools located in zip codes where the median household income is less than 50,000, 50,000 to 75,000, and more than 75,000. And here we see a pattern whereby there is a return in spring 2022 to the pre-pandemic average. However, we're not seeing parity across the income groups yet. If you click to the next slide, yep, you can see that there's also the exacerbation is coming out here. And I want to pause for a second here and talk about the percentage point differences, because even in the higher income group, that 2 percentage point difference might not seem like a lot, but that represents a lot of students if you think about how big our sample is. The iReady diagnostic is given to over 11 million students. And in this sample, we have close to 2 million. And then think about the difference in a percentage point from 16 to 21%. Again, this is a lot more students who are already in need or had some challenging circumstances. And now the problem has gotten a little bit larger. So
and Julia, just to make sure folks can see this, because we've been shifting whether increases or decreases.
Yes.
In this case, the higher the level, the worse the situation, correct? So
exactly. So I say the longer the bar, the more concerned we are in the below grade level data. And thank you, Hedy, because yes, you have to kind of flip your head when we're in the below grade level data to think in the opposite terms of what we're used to seeing. Yes. So a larger percentage means that there's more students who are likely in need of intensive intervention because they're 2 or more grade levels below. Yeah. Thank you. You can keep going. Yes, so this is the second to last, or possibly the last slide. Great. Oh, we've got all the information now. So we also go into all of those data cuts that you saw in reading in the math data, but we just want to show the high level of the overall math subject area. And here you can see there's a lot on the slide. So I'll tell you the story. In spring 2022, there are fewer students who are on grade level. Generally across the board, there's been improvement across all grades from spring of 2021. So we are getting better, but not yet back to that historical pre-pandemic average. And that's what we're seeing at a national level at Curriculum Associates. The data is very nuanced, even though I'm summarizing it here. So I'm looking forward to having you hear from our other panelists as well on what they're seeing.
Thank you so much, Julia. So Dan, what would you add to this picture that Julia is painting?
Well, in many ways, the picture that I would paint is pretty similar. If you'd go to the next slide. There's a project that I'm engaged in with colleagues at NWEA and at Harvard University, where we're working with a consortium of school districts tracking academic recovery and the efficacy of particular initiatives. And as part of that, we took a look at all of the test scores in the NWEA test bank in the fall of 2021. And this provides kind of a picture of what we saw. And the way to read this is the lighter color bars our student achievement for in standard deviation units, where this a bunch of wonky statisticians that are working on this, for different demographic groups in different grade levels. And that's what this picture shows. And the first thing I'd call out is that even before the pandemic, so if you look at the results for fall 2017, 18, and 19, there are students that are quite far behind. Students of color tend to be far behind Asian and white students. But then if you look at fall 2021, across all groups, there's a significant drop in the test scores. And why don't we flip to the next slide? And I want to kind of give a very quick sort of way to think about how to think about this drop. Because we could look at tests both pre-pandemic in the 2 years before the pandemic and the years that crossed the pandemic from 2019 to 2021, we could predict what student achievement looked like in gains over a 2-year period before the pandemic, and then look at the difference in the achievement across the 2 years that include the pandemic, and then see how the predictions vary from the actual gains. And that's what this picture shows. And the bars are negative across the board, and the bars are negative across the board because the pandemic had negative impacts across the board, but the magnitude of the negative impacts are not the same for all students. So if you stare hard at these slides, and again, you'll have these available to you and they're in the reports that are in the chat, that what you'd see is that the effects tend to be larger in earlier grades, and they tend to be larger for Black and Hispanic students. And so the pandemic had a disproportionate impact on students that tended to already be struggling. So it exacerbated pre-existing lines of inequity in student achievement. And if you'd flip to just the next slide. So the other thing that we can look at is the kind of the poverty level of schools serving different students. And it was disproportionately students in high poverty schools that were more affected by the pandemic. So as part of the work, what we've done is we've kind of tried to take apart, like, why do we see this variation in outcomes? And part of the story is that school systems were very different across the country in terms of how long they were in a remote status in the 2020-2021 school year. And so that's part of the story. But beyond that, we see a lot of variation across school systems that looked really similar in terms of the kind of students that are served, the amount of time that they were in remote status, the per pupil spending, et cetera. And so I think we'll get to this when we get into the discussion a little deeper, but it's really important for school systems to be really assessing the needs of their students, and also when we're tracking academic recovery, to think about where do we see bright spots and what can we learn from those bright spots, because my expectation is that we will see a lot of variation in how quickly school systems recover from the pandemic.
Pretty troubling, that exacerbation of the impact on particular groups, but also for our youngest learners.
Hedy, can I say just one other thing? Sorry,
Yep.
I forgot to mention, bars don't do justice to this impact. I think that it doesn't convey the magnitude of what's happened. The way that I tend to describe it is that what we see in terms of the test score loss, it's larger than what was seen during Hurricane Katrina for affected students. And that when you connect test scores to later life outcomes, it will cost those students, if they don't recover, trillions of dollars of lost future income.
Yep, we're really just seeing the first most immediate reflections. We're nowhere into the kind of long-term impacts and consequences for both individuals and us as a society. Absolutely. But hopefully we can also change that by looking at it early. Libby, Why don't you talk about what you see? And while we've been really looking at big national data, Ed Analytics does a lot more, a little bit at the state and local level. So I know that can add some more nuance to this understanding. And I promise everyone, we'll take this for about 5 more minutes on dwelling on what we're seeing from this. And then we're going to get into a conversation about what are we seeing works.
Yeah, thank you, Hedy. So at Education Analytics, we have data from a couple different sources that we've used to help our partners, so districts, states, other nonprofits, understand the impact of COVID on their students. We've used both annual state tests administered each spring before the pandemic and then since spring 2021, but we've also used a combination of interim assessments like MAP from NWEA and iReady from Curriculum Associates to measure students' learning at key intervals over the course of the pandemic. So we have data in particular from a large consortium of districts in California called the Core Districts. And we also have data from across the state of South Carolina, which I'm going to highlight here for you today. And those data have allowed us to monitor how students' growth, so their rate of learning, has evolved since spring 2020. So as Hedy mentioned, the data you've already seen from Julia and from Dan has painted a really helpful nationwide picture and picture across different states and districts. This is one example of what we can tell when we look within one state, but using a range of different assessments. Here we're looking at 6 different time periods: fall, winter, and spring of the 2020 to 21 school year, and fall, winter, and spring of the most recent school year, 2021 to 2022. We have data for students in grades 4 to 8, about 100,000 students in the state of South Carolina. So if you go to the next slide, this is just showing a very high level picture across all students, across all grades, and across all assessments, what we've seen since the pandemic started. So from left to right, you're seeing those same 6 time points: fall, winter, and spring of the 2020 to 2021 school year, and fall, winter, and spring of last school year. We have ELA on the left and math on the right. The numbers that you're seeing are essentially a rough approximation of the number of months of learning that we see differently between growth during this particular time period compared to growth before COVID. So for instance, in ELA, by fall 2020, that negative 1.2 number, that's telling us that on average, students grew 1.2 months less in ELA by fall 2020 than they had on average before COVID. And so this kind of U-shaped or V-shaped curve in ELA and the zigzags on math are telling us that by spring 2022, there was evidence of some recovery, that those numbers are starting to go up towards 0, which is good. 0 would mean that students are learning at a similar rate during COVID or in the current period that we're in compared to a similar pre-COVID time period, but we're not at 0 yet. Students are still not growing as quickly as they had in the past. And so I think it really underscores what Dan and Julia have also been sharing, that there is progress, there are bright spots. It's certainly not of enough magnitude for us to say that recovery has happened. One bright spot in particular that I want to call out, it's not on this slide, but when we just look at the state summative test in South Carolina, we do see evidence that last year, students grew faster on average than they had before COVID. So that suggests some degree of learning acceleration. But once again, that rate of acceleration is not fast enough to say that we've hit recovery. So we still have a long way to go. The main takeaway for me that I really want to emphasize is that even though we do see some evidence of accelerated growth in some grades and some subjects, it's not been intense enough to get students back to their pre-COVID learning levels, and it's really extremely varied. There is encouraging progress being made, but it's not consistent. So some students, some classes, some grades, some schools, some districts, and some states are more or less behind than others are. Different assessments can paint slightly different pictures depending on how standards aligned they are or how sensitive they are to short-term changes in student learning. For us at Education Analytics, we really believe that it's important to have these kinds of data at the state level or at the district level and even at the classroom level in the hands of people who can do something about it, because it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to recovery or to learning acceleration.
Thank you so much, Libby. I'm just reminded, I've heard this metaphor before of how the pandemic was like a huge storm, right? And we don't know what happened to people in that storm. Some people started the storm in yachts. Some people started them barely holding on to a tire, some on, in a rowboat. And one of the things that we're seeing, I think, in your data is the incredible variation in where kids are now in terms of their academics, their social, their emotional well-being. And the fact that it's even harder than ever to predict. It was probably never a great idea to say, oh, you're in first grade and therefore this is where you're at. But now it's even harder to predict based on kids' age or grade what they know or don't know, because there's so much variation in what's going on. That said, I want to actually ask Miah to join us, and Miah and Dan together as they're part of our NWEA team. Let me ask a quick question. Would you want to stop doing slides for a second and just talk about what some of those initiatives that you're seeing, Miah, or do you want to have the slides with Dan?
We can get rid of the slides.
Okay, we'll bring them on for Dan.
Okay.
No, I'm good.
I know that you have been looking across states and looking at initiatives going on. What are you starting to see?
Well,
that makes a difference?
Honestly, Hedy, your and Dan's comments about the potential ongoing impacts for a generation of learners, maybe even generations of learners, has like reemerged a sense of urgency for me. So I already felt urgent, but thinking about what this could mean for the next 10, 20, or 30 years has just reignited that spark. Right now, it is really too early for me to say definitively what is making a difference in student literacy outcomes. Like, we just don't have enough data on outcomes and inputs to say with certainty what is working. But I am encouraged by a lot of movement in states, districts, schools, and partners, in order to ensure that students are likely to get back on track. One thing that encourages me is that as of July 28th this year, 29 states and DC, where I live, have passed laws or implemented new policies related to evidence-based reading instruction since 2013. So like literally more than half of the states in DC have laws or legislation around teaching to the science of reading. At the state level, I'm encouraged by states like Arkansas, which is investing in both reading and writing. So they have the RISE, Reading Initiative for Student Excellence program, and that spans birth to grade 12 and includes a statewide pre-K foundational reading program. I'm also encouraged by states like Kansas, North Carolina, and Kentucky, where their leaders have realized the importance of reading in the disciplines and are working to improve discipline-specific literacy and writing across the curriculum. That's huge, because though foundational skills and K-3 early reading is critical, pivotal, is the foundation for the rest of a student's academic trajectory, there is a lot of reading that happens after grade 5. So absolutely. Our students who are in grade 4, they will continue to need support, and they will need discipline-specific literacy support. So there are lots of things at the state level that encourage me. I'm also encouraged by the work of community partners like 826 National and 826 DC, the Dolly Parton Foundation, and these organizations are organizations that seek to extend literacy and literacy learning beyond the school day. So that is encouraging to me. I'm encouraged by conversations I've had recently with higher education leaders who are committed to rethinking their teacher prep programs for reading. So I can think of one specific higher ed university president who's reached out and said, look, Miah, we really want to rethink our teacher prep program because we want our teachers to be prepared. So that indicates to me there are shifts in thinking happening in higher ed that I'm hopeful will have ripple effects for incoming teachers and students. And we're doing a lot of interesting work, my team at NWEA, that I'm actually really excited and hopeful about, that will improve student reading and writing outcomes.
Thank you so much. So Dan, I think, and we'll bring the slides back up, you're also starting to see some trends related to what people are working on at the district level?
Yeah, we can skip the slides.
Okay.
I think I'll just add a couple of thoughts. I think Miah did a great job of saying that there are some good things that we're seeing out there, and I won't add any more specifics, but that we need to be cautious before we jump to conclusions about what is working. And I want to say that one of the cautions comes out of this work that I would have, comes out of this work with the consortium of districts, in that it is hard to implement a lot of these programs in a tight labor market, and when we're trying to remediate, learning loss at scale. And so we're trying to do something at a national level that we've never tried to do before. And that creates scheduling problems, and it creates problems when you have to go through procurement processes and you get lots of bids to, do tutoring or something else. But I want to say one other thing, and I don't mean to be the Debbie Downer here, but I want to use this opportunity to say something to a large group of people who are interested, in that I am worried that there's not enough urgency around this for kids, and that this comes up in two ways. One, I'm skeptical that we can actually jam all learning recovery into the regular school day and year. I think that for lots of kids, they will just need extra time, and extra time is controversial. And you can see that from, the uproar that came out of trying to add 4 days to the school year in LA Unified. And so what that means to me is that school systems really need to be conveying to parents in ways that are broadly accessible, understandable, not standard deviation units, but like your child is, in some cases behind or well behind where we would expect grade level wise. And that's why we are in favor of extending the school year, or that's why we want your help in making sure that your student attends summer school. Because some of those extra time endeavors, it's not just in it's not just the schools that can snap the fingers and make it happen. It requires participation.
Wouldn't that, though, the implication, though, it's not just about extending the school day, it's about creating learning opportunities in many more settings. Yeah. And one of the challenges, I think, is that affluent families, when my kid had struggled with algebra, I called a tutor, I got that. And I mean, this is pre-pandemic, but if you're not a family who has those resources, then the question is how, so this is why the investment in community schools initiative, expanded learning. But I also wonder if we have to be looking beyond just saying, well, this is all going to happen in the school doors and kids are going to spend more time on campuses.
100%. I 100% agree with you. I think some of it is going to happen inside the schoolhouse on Saturdays and summers and, in longer years. But I also think that the point you raise is that parents have different resources. And so some of the initiatives that I do think are encouraging are providing some of the resources like on-demand, online tutoring to families that might not have the wherewithal to procure those resources on their own. So school systems are providing this.
Mm-hmm. And I slightly, I'm going to maybe disagree with Dan, but maybe add a little context. So more time, I wish I had more time to do everything that I needed to do. So I'm always in favor of more time, but beyond more time, I think we could do a better job of rethinking the good use of time that we currently have. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I was a classroom teacher for almost 10 years. A lot of time is lost in transition. A lot of time is lost in non-instructional activities. A lot of time is wasted doing things that don't actually meet instructional goals. So where I might disagree with Dan a little bit is before I advocated for more time, I would probably advocate for an evaluation of the time schools have and a better use of the instructional time, right? So if I were a school leader, I would wonder how much time during the reading block is actually spent reading. Like of those 90 minutes, how many of them are spent reading? If I were a high school principal or leader or middle school principal or leader, I would wonder in my discipline classes like science and social studies, how much content are students given, i.e. summarized or reduced, versus our students taught to read science in 10th grade the way that we know if you learn how to read the science, you will have a better understanding of the content, right? So I would probably advocate before more time, an evaluation of the time that we have to make sure that we're even using that time well to improve student outcomes.
And then I'm going to ask others to join in. I also wonder about, is there a balance between the issue of time and engagement? Because if kids have a lot of time in something that they don't like, we actually push them away.
Oh, there's lots of
So there's also the you know, the quality and whether you're doing it well, but are you making the kid, bringing back the joy of learning? And whether that's also part of that evaluation of the effectiveness of what we're doing while kids are involved in instruction and involved in activities aimed at accelerating their learning.
Yes, right. So there is a lot of compliance happening in schools, and there's a lot of disengagement happening in schools. I think we're all aiming for engaged, interested learners that get them academically engaged in the content. So they're building their competency, they're building knowledge, they're building skills. Honestly, one of the best stories I've heard about a teacher's classroom came from a woman named Faith Phillips, who's in Oklahoma. Her students have won at least one national podcast award. She was a lawyer, left the legal profession, came and taught back in her local community in Stillwell, Oklahoma, and had her students, high school English, had her students research a local topic of their choosing, and walk them through how to create a podcast. And the research group she created has students deeply enmeshed in local research, national research. They were communicating with local and national politicians. And so at the end of this, these massive research projects, every student group had to create a podcast. Her students ended up winning the NPR National Student Podcast on investigative journalism. But what was interesting is that, number one, they're interesting. So as an adult, I've listened to some of them. I'm like, wow, this is happening in Oklahoma. But the number of skills in terms of research, reading, writing, tech, and the body of knowledge that they're building, her students were active, engaged, and excited. So I think there's a point where we also have to begin to rethink how we're engaging students, the kind of activities we're asking students to do. Are we still committed? And I was a teacher, so are we still committed to like worksheets and books, or have we moved into having them create something meaningful and produce something that's useful for themselves and their community? And I think I've seen bright spots of some teachers moving in that direction. And I would just encourage those teachers to be mentors and North Stars for others who are still holding on to the butterfly unit. And I love butterflies, so I'm not opposed to the dinosaur unit. I'm just saying we can evolve the dinosaur unit.
Thank you. That's a great illustration. Libby, what would you add to this? What are you starting to see makes a difference?
Yeah, so if we don't mind pulling up the slides, I have just a couple of visual to accompany. And I want to double down on what we've been hearing, that there's a big body of evidence of what kinds of things can work and have worked. To Dan's point, I think we don't yet have a big body of evidence of what are the interventions or strategies that are working right now, given the context that we're in during COVID. So just want to highlight what I'm sharing here are kind of some bright spots, some areas of opportunity that we've seen in our work. So one of these is a tutoring program that we house at EA. It's part of a federal EIR grant to scale up evidence-based intervention. So this program is called Future Forward. It pairs one-on-one reading tutoring that occurs at the school during the school day, along with family engagement strategies. And if you go to the next slide, there's an abundance of evidence that this program has worked in the past to truly make a difference in student skills and knowledge. Can we advance to the next slide? And there's a really big body of evidence that tutoring programs like this can make a difference. But speaking to many of the comments in the chat and what we've been hearing, tutoring is not a universal solution. It is expensive in terms of time and in terms of money and in terms of human capital, and who are the people who can actually deliver this kind of intensive instruction. So we need ways to be able to target these kinds of solutions, these kind of interventions to the students who need it and who will benefit from them the most. If you go to the next.
Can I just clarify something? So this is evidence based on based on research before the pandemic, or
That's right.
research that was conducted during the pandemic?
This is based on research conducted before the pandemic.
But the assumption is then, if it worked before the pandemic, it at least makes it a highly likely strategy for helping to improve things, and we then still need to evaluate it during the pandemic?
That's right. The evidence points to these kinds of tutoring programs as having typically been very successful at helping support struggling students, particularly in early literacy. But we don't know that in the last year or the last 2 years, these kinds of interventions have systematically made a difference to the extent where we can say if they've done enough. And I know some of the work that Dan and others have done suggests that the impact of these kinds of interventions is likely not large enough in magnitude to really catch students up in and of themselves. They need to be paired with other kinds of strategies, other kinds of solutions.
Great.
So if you go to the next slide, as we think about how to target interventions to students, one way that we've helped work with districts and states to support that kind of work is through a dashboard we created during COVID as a response to COVID called the Rally Analytics Platform. This is a dashboard for educators that displays all of the students' past academic assessments, so a combination of interim or benchmark and summative assessments, along with predictions of their future performance based on their individual testing history, side by side with results from a student well-being survey. And this really is a tool that allows educators to see at an individual student level, at a classroom level, at a school level, how their students are doing. If you go to the next slide, one way that we visualize these data and report these data is using an MTSS framework where we can indicate which students in a classroom, a grade, or a school fall into tier 1, 2, or 3 based on their assessment data as well as their well-being survey data. And so in the state of South Carolina that I already mentioned, as districts were starting to formulate their applications for how to use ESSER funds, we took all of the data from this platform and exported them into spreadsheets for all of the districts in the state of South Carolina and provided each district with the data for their students. And they used these data to then identify how many and which students were in need of interventions in math or in English language arts. And then they tied their planned use of ESSER funds to support those particular students' growth in those particular areas. And so use of data at the local level, like these kinds of data, can be one way that teachers and principals and district level staff can match the strategy for recovery or for acceleration with the students and the skills that need targeting. So the metaphor I like to use is, if you have a lawn and you see some brown spots, we can't just plop a sprinkler down and water everything and assume the lawn is going to turn out the way we want it. We really need to be able to figure out, where do we have to add fertilizer? Where do we need to lay down more seed? Where do we need to mow? Where do we need to pull weeds? These are the kinds of data that are nuanced enough to allow educators and leaders to tailor the kinds of interventions to the students who need them. And I think that has to be hand in hand with some of these systematic approaches that are being discussed today, like extended learning time, like more innovative approaches to delivering instruction. None of these things on their own are going to work. I think it has to be a multi-pronged approach.
Thank you so much. So Julia, going back to you, because you really had a opportunity to also try to look for these bright spots and promising efforts. What would you add to this? What are you seeing that makes a difference?
It's a great question, Hedy. So in addition to the study that I went through before, we carried out another study. You can keep going to the next slide, looking for schools that exceeded expectations during the pandemic, because we knew anecdotally that they were out there. At the national level, when you're looking at all the data, it can be a bit overwhelming at times. In some ways, our local colleagues tell us that it's comforting in some ways to see that the issues that occur in your classroom are also occurring at the national level. But we also wanted to highlight some of the good things that are happening, how people are recovering. So really quickly, it was a two-phase study. There was a quantitative component and then a qualitative component. You can keep going. We'll just get to the goods here. So we are looking at schools that exceed expectations. We define that by schools whose students exceeded their stretch growth, which is a type of annual growth that the iReady diagnostic provides. And this is a attainable but challenging measure of growth for students who are not necessarily on grade level, but who can therefore get to grade level. So you can keep going. From the quantitative analysis, we identified 301 schools that exceeded expectations. You can move the slides forward. Of these, nearly half of them were schools that had some economic challenges, and nearly a quarter served primarily students of color. So you can keep going to our 6 promising leadership practices that emerge. So as you gaze across this slide, I won't necessarily read each one out loud, but these are things that educators are already doing and have been doing. So this didn't strike us as innovative or new, but as necessary. And the important thing is that this is what emerged from the 16 schools that were interviewed as part of the qualitative component. And we interviewed the leaders at the school level and sometimes the district level of schools serving students who were in economically challenged circumstances, serving students of color. And these are the things that they were doing during that really, really tricky 20 to 21 school year. So these are things that we know educators can do, and we want to reiterate that these practices can be done, right? And the educators didn't necessarily do every single one. These are the common themes that emerged out of these interviews. We do have a report that I think has already been posted in the chat, and that I'll post as well, where we dig deeper into what are the actual things, like, for example, the use of Chromebooks, and the linking out to families was super important too. So we have verbatims and we have a lot more information that you can dig into, but would love to encourage you to pop things into the chat or Q&A if these are things that resonate with you, or things that you've done differently as well. And I also kind of want to add to what Libby was saying with the lawn analogy, because I was thinking, like, yes, and I'm doing a lot of native planting right now. And I think it's also important to understand what is native to the school environment, and harnessing that really, and surfacing that, which teachers know best what's going to be best for their students too. So wanted to share this with you all and pass it back. Go ahead.
And well, so Julie, actually, we're sticking with you. So one of your part is about creating a culture of data. And I want to unpack that a little bit. And we want to acknowledge, because we just talked about these huge disparities. Kids are in different places all over the place. So how do you really build that local capacity to use data to inform practice? So maybe you know that it's not the approach that you're using isn't quite the right one, right? Maybe you tried to plant something from outside and it's not transplanting well, or maybe you're not identifying the right spot on the lawn that you have to invest more support for. So how do you build that local capacity?
Yeah, so I'm gonna have my curriculum associates hat on, but also my non-curriculum associates hats on. So at Curriculum Associates, if you are a customer of the iReady diagnostic, we provide a report that has student can-dos, like what can they already do, what skills have they already mastered, and what do they still need to learn. And we want to provide that at the point of instruction to teachers. Teachers will often set up data chats with their students, and that can be a really great way to break the ice, but also to help empower the student to understand what they want to learn and grow in as well. We've also seen really strong success across the school, from classroom to school to district, with data chats that go from teacher to principal and then all the way up to superintendent level. So I think in a nutshell, it's really demystifying the data, having the right data in hand that is going to tell you what you need to know in order to help your students, and to have some clear communication that can transcend out of the classroom level all the way up to the accountability level and back down, so that everybody is able to see the same thing and be able to really sing the same chorus, same song.
Thank you. You know what? I want to bring other folks into this. If we could have everyone, Miah, Dan, Libby, join. What else do you see as needing to happen to build local capacity to take these more tailored approaches?
So I'm going to tell on myself. So please, I apologize in advance. I like to tell people I owe a lot of students refunds, and I taught public school, which is free for those first couple of years. So when I was in the classroom, and even when I was a district leader and a state leader, there is no lack of data. There was honestly almost an overabundance of data. There was so much data, I often found myself swimming in it. And it took me getting out of the classroom and working in different spaces for me to realize I had no idea how to read it. So when I was in the classroom, we would be given state level data, district level data, classroom level data, your formative assessment data, all the data. And we would often be given the reports, and in a very quick, maybe an hour staff meeting, there would be you need to talk about this, and as your teams talk about what this data means. All of the data would read differently. The numbers would show up differently. The scales would be different. And as teachers, we would get it and try to make sense out of it. So I would say one of the best things that leaders can do is, number one, help teachers understand what data they need, right? So I might even argue that NAEP data is kind of interesting, but didn't really impact my day-to-day instructional planning. I don't really need to spend an hour unpacking NAEP data as a classroom teacher. I do need to spend time unpacking NAEP data as a state leader, right? So helping teachers understand, of all the data you get, which ones are most important for you and for what purpose. And I would also encourage leaders to invest in data literacy, because I think there are a lot of assumptions that because you have a master's degree or even a Ph.D., you understand how to read the charts in front of you. And that is an assumption you should challenge.
Thank you so much. I want to open up for other members of our panelists, but I also want to remind the audience that you can start to ask questions in the Q&A, and we can also be responding to those. So Dan or Libby, what would you add to this? How do we build local capacity? And so appreciate Miah's point about let's get clear on what we need data for whom to do what. So yeah.
I mean, honestly, I think that was such a good answer that I worry that anything I say diminishes the response. I could not agree more about the fact that schools are kind of flooded with data, but that they don't always use it as well as I think they could. The one thing that I, aside from the sort of the way that it is interpreted and which, what data for whom, I think that it's really important that people need to realize that there's value in the underlying information. So it is not treated, that using data is not treated as merely a compliance exercise, which is what I think that's the case in too many places. And if it is treated that way, then I just cannot imagine that it's actually being used for the good of students.
I think all I'll add is that, as others have said, increasing capacity for data use, that's not a new challenge, but it's radically more acute. And it's also harder because we're placing a lot more demands on educators and stress on the educational system. And so I think it's really important that we not treat it as something extra or additional. One way we've been thinking about this at Education Analytics is how do we combine evidence-based professional development around effective data use with user-centered design principles that actually tap into how teachers work and the realities of their school day, along with data infrastructure and technology. So one thing that's really important to us is how do we actually bring data from multiple different sources into one place for teachers to use so that we really minimize the amount of logging into 5 different systems, remembering your username and passwords, copying and pasting, printing out a bunch of stuff, and trying to get a picture of what's actually happening with your students. That's one of the principles behind that Rally platform is like, we want lots of different assessment data. We want survey data right there side by side. One initiative we're working on right now is taking a professional development program called Teacher as Researcher that was developed by Marzano Research. And it really trains teachers in how to think like a researcher and use data in their classrooms to design rapid cycle experiments on instructional strategies to figure out what's working for their students in their classrooms. And what we've been building at Education Analytics is a really user-friendly platform to be able to scale up that PD model across the state of South Carolina. And importantly, that uses something called EdFi, which is a data interoperability model that allows us to directly and securely connect to different assessment platforms, to student information systems that have things like grade books and attendance records, so that all of that data can be in one place so that teachers can actually try out, this week, I want to try this instructional strategy with my class. I want to use baseline data, whether it's assessment data or other kinds of outcome data. And then I want to be able to see if it's working. And then we actually take the results of those teacher-led experiments, and the plan is to house them all in a clearinghouse so that other teachers can see what each other has tried. And it kind of creates this almost crowdsourced evidence base where teachers can also say what they liked about the instructional strategy. They can give it like a Yelp rating. And our strategy here is like, as we think about building up data use and capacity for data use, doubling down on Miah's point about what kinds of data and for whom, this is really about how do we tap into what teachers already know how to do, what they're already experts in, and really provide tools and resources that allow them to do that better and make it easier. So really not thinking about data as an add-on or as an extra, but trying to really integrate it into their regular workflow. It sounds really nice. It sounds simple. It's very challenging. It requires a lot of resources and a lot of time. And I think importantly, requires a lot of educators themselves to be thought partners to us as to how to really make that work for them. Otherwise, it's just going to be another tool or another data point, another, content area meeting or grade level meeting that feels like it's taking away from the bread and butter of what teachers are being asked to do on a daily basis.
I think I absolutely appreciate that there's the issue of making it more part of your daily routine, so it's not something extra. And Dan, your point about not making it about compliance, because then you don't really truly value what you're seeing. I also wonder if there is a concern also about data being used against you. So this is where teachers worry that they're going to be held accountable and blamed for something, especially in a pandemic where, the test scores are getting worse. And how do we, and I also think families, it's also an issue. So when people are having conversations with families too about where's their kid going, there is an element, and often I hear the blame coming in, but you didn't invest in extra resources for your kid during the pandemic to read, when maybe a family had 2 different jobs. So there's the risk of the data also going into blame games, either for principals and administrators or for teachers or even at the family level. How do we avoid the blame game?
Hedy, I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a really important point, and this existed before the pandemic. I would argue that for too many kids, that schools just are not, they are worried about giving having to convey a negative message, having to tell some bad news. And I think that parents sometimes don't get the message because of the way that information gets couched, but that parents need to get transparently know where their kids are, because they don't know to act in certain ways unless they understand where their kids are. And I was a little shocked when I started to see some public surveys about what parents thought about student achievement that just have come out over the summer. And lots of parents think that their kids have completely recovered from the pandemic, which is clearly not the case. And teachers, I think, are optimistic. And so especially when you get kids at in early grades, maybe the kids are a little behind, but you say, oh, they've got their whole educational career in front of them, and so they can catch up. But that's not typically what we see. Empirically, we do not see that when kids are behind, they oftentimes do not catch up. Test scores are way too predictive, to my mind, of high school outcomes. And in a way, you'd hope that they weren't so predictive, because if a kid is struggling when they're first tested in the third grade in most places, you wouldn't want the third grade test to be so predictive of the likelihood of, high school graduation or the course taking patterns in high school, because there would have been intervention early enough on to help kids who are struggling. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I think that it's a question that predates the pandemic, and maybe in the pandemic, it's a time to say, look, this affected all of us in every walk of life, in schools, out of schools. This is a time where we really want to double down on being honest about where things stand, without casting blame on, why kids are in a particular place, and just focusing on how to get them back on track.
I think if I can piggyback on that briefly, Hedy, and thank you, Dan, I think that's all accurate. Some of the things that emerged from the conversations with leaders during the pandemic, specific to engaging families, was establishing mutual trust and mutual communication, and doing that diligently and proactively, and through a number of ways, whether it was saying hi to a parent as they were dropping a kid off, if the kid was going to school, or creating additional opportunities for parents to come into the school after school hours and things like that. And I think, to Dan's point, it was understanding that both groups, the educators and the families, hold the students' interests as the highest need, and clearing that lane for communication.
So I completely agree with Dan, but I like to call myself optimistically pragmatic. So I completely agree. The data was consistently clear prior to the pandemic that once the student has not met the grade level expectations, the chances of them catching up or meeting them become increasingly more slim as they move up through the grades. Like, that is not a new story. I want to go back to the earlier comment about time, and I want to maybe include space, right? So the school is a fixed building in most places, and the school day is a fixed time in most places. So I've begun to think about, what are the other opportunities that exist for students outside of the school day where they can be actively engaged in learning, right? So I am in DC, I grew up in Detroit, I've lived in Nashville, I've lived in Vegas, and I'm speaking almost completely to like the urban centers, but in every urban center, there are typically ongoing opportunities, community organizations, museums, universities that are doing a lot of work to get students engaged and to keep them engaged after school and during the summer. So I would encourage parents who are in places that have thriving communities to investigate those. And many of them are free, or at least have a very, very low nominal cost to investigate those to keep students engaged in learning. So one thing I didn't get into the weeds on is the importance of building knowledge, right? We didn't even talk about that. So when we're teaching students to learn how to read and making readers out of them, absolutely, they need the foundational skills. That's a hard stop, there's a period. However, when you read, what your brain does is it takes things you already know, and it takes the new thing you're reading, and it tries to form connections between the two. So it wants to take the new thing and attach it to something that already exists. So the more things you already know, the more knowledge you already have, it makes it just easier for your brain to forge that new connection to the new thing. So in other talks, I like to talk about one of my little cousins. He is 7. He's very precocious and he is a reader. He loves art, loves art. So last fall, my aunt and I, we took him to one of the immersive Van Gogh experiences. I think it was $20, right? He got in free. It's $20 for me, $20 for her. And we take this 7-year-old to the Van Gogh exhibit. And if you haven't been, it's really cool. I had a great time. So you first walk in, and the antechamber is full of text. Like there are these massive 6-foot, 7-foot Van Gogh renditions, and like right next to them is text, and the text is written for adults, and there's a lot of like adult heavy language. So we spent probably the first 20 minutes with the 7-year-old. He went to every slide, he tried to sound out the words. And my aunt is a retired reading teacher, and I was a reading teacher. So we're talking to Braylon, and he's trying to figure out what's happening. And we're asking him questions. Well, why would Van Gogh do this? He cut off his ear. Why would somebody do that, right? So we're engaging with him in the exhibit. And then there's like a smaller chamber where there's like a light show and music, and their Van Gogh paintings are, moving across the walls. So he's having the time of his life. He's dancing around looking at the paintings. And then you get into the large exhibit. And in the large exhibit, there are all Van Gogh paintings, and they melt into each other, and several of them have been animated. So like there might be a pastoral picture of a field, and the birds are like flying across the field. All things that are super engaging for a 6 and 7-year-old. And so we're looking at the art, and it's kind of quiet. And he goes, Miah, that picture. And I would say, well, Brandon, what do you think is happening? And he's making up stories for the pictures. Now that's interesting. But when he left, as we're in the car going home, he goes, Miah, what's Impressionism? And we had a whole conversation about Impressionism, a word he literally just picked up at the exhibit. And so we talked more about the paintings, and the next day he has a word of the day. My aunt sent me his new word of the day list, and he had several words that were art related. That is literacy, right? Yeah. That is learning. Like, so he's going to take that experience that was 90 minutes, and he's going to fold that into the next couple of books he reads. He's going to make connections. So I would encourage parents and aunts and uncles to think about all of the ways that literacy is literally living in students' communities, and capitalize on that if you don't have the financial resources to pay $100 for a tutor.
So Miah, I totally agree. And this is actually a key theme of the campaign, literacy in every setting, promoting those opportunities. I'm curious, going back to the research question, do any of you, Dan, Julia, Libby, know of research that has shown the impact either of summer learning or expanded learning opportunities, or creating expanded opportunities in the community? So are we starting to collect data that shows that there is an impact, and especially for our youngest learners, about creating those additional opportunities for learning that can happen, and might even be especially essential given, our teachers, it has been challenging, and we're still trying to recruit teachers, so but any research on those expanded learning opportunities?
There's a lot of research on expanded learning opportunities, summer learning opportunities. I have not seen where it is sort of all put together in one place. What I see is sort of one-offs where people are studying a particular kind of program. So it's a little hard to sort of say, go look at because it sort of falls in lots of different journals, and that are studying lots of different programs across lots of different contexts. And the effects are different. I think that this is a good example of where you can't kind of say, well, a program that looks like X works, that the details around implementation seem to really matter when you're measuring the outcome, when the outcome is looking at student, measures of student achievement. Sometimes it looks like the expanded opportunities work, and sometimes it looks like they don't work so well.
Another question that comes to my mind is what other measures of success we maybe should be looking at beyond sort of test scores, reading, which we have. And I'll give an example. This is actually high school and chronic absence. There is evidence from some research that you could almost take an added value approach, that certain teachers actually improve the attendance of their kids more. Okay, and it's looking at the same kid and over time what's changed about their attendance. But it's also true that the teachers who improved the attendance of their kids weren't necessarily the same teachers who improved the test scores for their kids. And that there's maybe, this is still early evidence, some suggestion that the teachers who improved attendance were actually also more likely to make sure their kids, I think it was, went on to post-secondary, okay? But they didn't improve their test scores. It brings to me this complicated thing of engagement and then test scores, and how do we think about the multiple measures? And then for our younger kids, there may be measures of family engagement that are separate from kid engagement. So as we start to continue to look at this research, is there a way to look at best practices from beyond the lens of a sort of an academic assessment, and how might we look at that to identify what else helps our kids?
I can jump in.
Go ahead, Libby.
Oh, sorry. So I'll just jump in to say that we've done a lot of research at Education Analytics on student survey measures of social emotional learning and school culture and climate. In particular, we've looked at different metrics. So you mentioned this Hedy value-added measures, or essentially trying to isolate the causal impact of schools and of teachers on changes in student self-reported social emotional learning. And the kind of high level takeaway, the too long didn't read, is these are squishy things. So the same metrics, the same statistics, the same methods that we use on things like academic test data aren't necessarily automatically translatable to things like survey data, but those kinds of survey data are really important for painting a broader picture than just test scores at a lot of different levels. So a couple of things we've seen in our research include things like social emotional skills tend to not increase as students get older. They actually tend to go down, with the exception of growth mindset. We see in student self-efficacy that middle school girls in particular start reporting much lower self-efficacy starting in 6th grade, even though in elementary school they report higher self-efficacy than boys do. These kinds of data, I think, are really important, even if they can't be used for, accountability measures, or even if they can't be used to say, this teacher is doing a better job than this other teacher of improving student social emotional skills. I think the sheer act of collecting those data and putting them in the hands of teachers, principals, district leaders, state leaders, I think that sends a really important signal that there are other kinds of data beyond just test scores. Attendance is a really, another really good example, or college going measures. I think we need to, at the risk of feeling like it's just more and more data points, we need to continue to explore appropriate and valid uses of these other kinds of data sources that paint a bigger and better and more complete picture of students and schools.
Julia.
I was heading in the same direction, and I posted a link in the chat of a piece that I'd read that was authored by Linda Diamond and some other folks. But yes, I think there's a lot more that can be done with the enrichment experience. And there, like Dan was saying, like there is research on each of them. I think there is I don't know that anybody's gone out and studied it comprehensively, but there's some great links from within the link that I posted on relationship building, social emotional development, and increasing opportunities across the community.
Thank you. Miah, I'm going to ask you a question that is actually up in the Q&A, so you can answer it. The question is, what is a platform similar to iReady that supports NWEA map testing that can meet students where they are as a result of the data?
So I don't know how to answer that because I'm not familiar to the iReady platform. So our map growth test provides information about where students are. So I'm not really sure how to answer the question about what is a platform that's similar. I would need a little bit of time to investigate, and I can get back with the panelists if you can send a follow-up.
Okay, I will let the campaign folks. So we are coming to the close of our time. I'm just wondering if any of you have closing advice for those schools, districts, communities who are feel that sense of urgency that we've talked about, that we got to help our youngest, especially our youngest learners, given we know that that lays a foundation for the future to learn as we come back to school this year. We're only in month 1, 2. What's your advice to folks about how do they accelerate, support, expand, invest in making sure that especially the kids who've had the least opportunities before the pandemic and exacerbated challenges during the pandemic have an equal opportunity to learn?
I have a couple pieces of advice for different kind of stakeholders in the system. First, I want to come back to a point we all talked about, which I think is important, but cuts against the way a lot of people are talking about test scores, which is that that I've heard a lot of people out in the community say, well, they're not really important. We shouldn't pay attention. And I don't think they're the be all end all, but I think that they are an important gauge of student learning. And I say that because of their predictive power about the future for students. So I guess I would say, if you hear that, I would push back a little bit because empirically speaking, they matter. The other thing is that school systems have a lot of federal money for recovery right now. And I was hoping that the federal government was going to require states, and then states would require local systems to be a little bit more precise about exactly what they're doing with the money, and making sure that it added up to plausible academic recovery. I don't think when we look at the kind of initiatives that school systems are engaged in, lots of smart things. I don't want to say that it's sort of what I'm saying now is sort of across the board true, but in a lot of places, you would not think, based on some of the studies that were mentioned earlier that we know from pre-pandemic studies about, like, tutoring, that the interventions would kind of put together at scale, add up to academic recovery in the time frame that school systems have the extra funding. So I would say to people who have a say in sort of the local district plans, that local district plans should add up to plausible academic recovery. The trajectory of recovery should look like kids are going to at least get back to where they were pre-pandemic, even though for lots of kids that was not good enough. And then the last thing is just to come back to the point I made earlier about parents getting kind of the straight scoop on where their kids are, is that for any parents that are out there, I would ask them to ask schools if they get like test scores back in an email or something, but there's no discussion, like, what does this mean? is my child on grade level? Should I be worried? I think sometimes parents have to ask some of those questions of school systems to get past the hard issue that that teachers face in giving this straight scoop.
Thank you, Dan, for that. Really thoughtful. I'm going to ask Miah, Julia, and Libby each offer one idea, and then I want to be able to make sure that the campaign can close. And I'm also letting folks know that the campaign has posted a poll, so we'd love to get your thoughts, your reactions. But Miah.
The first thing that came to mind for me, and I completely agree with everything that Dan said, is to think differently about student assignment practices. Tracking students and keeping the students who are underperforming completely isolated from their grade level peers is not a good idea. So I would encourage districts and schools to think differently about their student assignment practices to make sure that all students have access to grade level material in an ongoing fashion.
Thank you. Libby, you want to go next?
Sure. I generally try to stay in my lane and recognize that even though I am a former teacher, it's been more than a decade since I've been in the classroom, and now I'm kind of hiding behind a computer screen thinking about data. So I don't want to assume that I kind of know how teachers or educators can best respond right now. I would just say that, from my point of view, I think even though it can often feel like we're drowning in a sea of data, I think it's really important to still try to monitor how our students are doing. And given that we really do see so much variability, there may be some students that are really excelling right now and doing just fine. And there may be other students that are doing okay academically, but their mental health is really suffering, or their home environment has really taken a turn for the worse. And so I just think, I've heard some refrains of like, we know it's bad, we don't need to keep reporting how bad things are. And although I can understand it feels bad, I think that especially at the local level, for individual students, for parents, for teachers, we do still need to be measuring and monitoring how things are going. And in turn, that will be really important data that allow us to evaluate what's working and under what conditions, because a lot of the things we know have worked in pre-pandemic times. We think are working now, we hope they're working now, but we don't yet have the data to tell us when and why. And that's really important given the variability that we see in student outcomes right now.
Thank you so much. And I know Becky is needing to close us out. So Julia, you can make one short, quick statement.
I know, yeah, it's so hard to choose just one. I will say engage and inspire. I think if we can engage and inspire at all levels, including teachers and students, that will have great impacts and effects, but there's a lot more to say. And on that note, you can close us out.
Thank you so much. And I'm turning it over. Becky, thank you so much.
Thank you, Hedy, and thank you to each of our panelist presenters today. This has been such an extraordinary conversation, and the chat has been so lively. I love it. There have been so much back and forth, and I want to thank all of our presenters for really engaging in the chat and the Q&A as well today. I think we have that poll that we tried to load up at the beginning back for you on digital equity. So Sierra, if we could do that quick before we sign off. So just tell us quickly if you think that digital equity is one of the important things for the campaign to keep focusing on. And you can just take a couple of minutes to do that. And then I am going to post in the chat links, registration links for our upcoming webinars. I think that did not get posted publicly earlier on, so those are there. And we would love for you to join us for our upcoming webinars. You can see that here, and all of the slides, all of the resources, plus more will be coming out to you, including the recording late this week or early next week at the very latest. And we look forward to having you all on here with us again soon. So once again, thanks to our presenters and thanks to our ASL interpreters today. It is wonderful to have you here with us. And Sierra, special thanks to you for keeping the wheels on the bus as we move through the conversation today. And Hedy, thank you for moderating once again for us.
My pleasure.